The jungle was silent, except for the faint echo of gunfire in the distance. Smoke drifted over the ridge like a ghost, and amid the chaos, one man knelt on the blood-soaked ground, whispering words that became legend. "Lord, please, help me get one more." That man was Desmond Doss, a frail, soft-spoken medic who refused to carry a weapon. A man mocked, beaten, and humiliated by his own brothers in arms. Yet, on that brutal night at Hacksaw Ridge, he would do the impossible. He would descend into hell and emerge a savior. But to understand how a man without a gun became one of the greatest heroes in American military history, we need to go back to where it all began. Because Desmond Doss was not supposed to be there. Not on that ridge. Not in that war. And certainly not standing unarmed before an army of Japanese soldiers. Desmond Thomas Doss was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, in 1919. The world was still recovering from the First World War, and America was struggling through the Great Depression. His father, a veteran named William Doss, was a carpenter. A man haunted by his own demons, often drowned in alcohol and rage. His mother, Bertha, was the light in his darkness. Devout, gentle, and fiercely religious. In the Doss household, the 10 Commandments were not just teachings, they were law. And for young Desmond, one commandment stood above all others: "Thou shalt not kill." It wasn't just a verse. It was a vow that would one day make him both a target of ridicule and a symbol of divine courage. As a child, Desmond was quiet, almost shy, but beneath that silence burned an unshakable conviction. He loved nature, climbed trees, and helped his mother with chores, often humming hymns under his breath. Yet there was one moment, one event, that would define the course of his life forever. He was only a boy when his father got into a violent argument with his uncle. Words turned into fists. A gun was drawn. Desmond, terrified, grabbed it to stop them. The weapon went off, nearly killing his father. That day, he looked at the gun in his trembling hands and swore, "I will never touch a weapon again." It wasn't just fear, it was faith. And that faith would soon be tested by a world at war. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the nation. America was thrown into the flames of the Second World War. Posters appeared on every street corner. "Your country needs you." Men rushed to enlist. Patriotism surged like wildfire. Desmond wanted to serve too. He wasn't a coward, far from it. But he made it clear he would never take a life. He would save them instead. When he enlisted in the U.S. Army, he did so as a combat medic. No gun, no bullets, just his Bible, his faith, and a small medical kit. But the Army wasn't ready for a man like Desmond Doss. From the moment he arrived at basic training, Doss became a target. His commanding officers saw him as a problem, his fellow soldiers as a joke. When he refused to pick up a rifle, they cursed him. When he knelt to pray, they mocked him. When he held his Bible, they called him a coward. At night, his bunkmates threw their boots at him, shouting that he didn't belong. And maybe they were right, because what kind of soldier refuses to fight? But Desmond didn't flinch. Every insult, every punch, every humiliation, he absorbed it with quiet resolve. He wasn't there to prove them wrong. He was there to prove something greater, that faith, even in the darkest hour, could move mountains. There was a day during training when his sergeant, Howell, forced him to hold a rifle. "Doss, you're in the Army now. You'll do what you're told." Desmond simply shook his head. "Sir, I can't. It's against my faith." That small act of defiance nearly destroyed him. He was dragged before a court-martial, accused of disobeying orders, a crime that could land him in prison. But when the judge asked him to explain himself, Desmond stood tall, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm willing to go to the front lines. I'll save as many men as I can. But I can't take a life. That's my conviction, and I won't break it." The courtroom fell silent. Even his accusers were moved. In the end, the military couldn't deny his right to serve as a conscientious objector. He would go to war without a weapon. By 1945, the world was on fire. The Pacific Theater had become a nightmare of blood and mud. and the island of Okinawa was about to become one of the deadliest battlegrounds in history. Perched atop a 400-foot cliff known as Maeda Escarpment, or Hacksaw Ridge, lay a Japanese stronghold fortified with tunnels, machine guns, and artillery. The Americans called it suicide. The Japanese called it home. It was here that Desmond Doss would face his ultimate test. The soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division climbed the ridge under a rain of bullets. Bodies fell like leaves. The air reeked of cordite and blood. Doss, unarmed, carried the wounded on his back, one after another, whispering prayers as explosions tore the earth apart. But that's not the night we're talking about yet. That night, the night that would make him a legend, was still to come. For now, all we need to understand is this. Desmond Doss was no ordinary man. He was a contradiction in uniform. A soldier without a gun, a medic without fear, and a believer surrounded by death. As his unit prepared to storm Okinawa, Doss opened his Bible and read a verse that had carried him through every trial. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He closed it gently, tucked it into his jacket, and looked out at the horizon. The sea was calm, too calm. The sun dipped below the waves, staining the sky crimson. In just hours, that same horizon would explode in fire. Desmond didn't pray for victory. He prayed for strength. Strength to do what others could not. Strength to stand in hell and still hold on to his faith. Because in the coming days, he would crawl through smoke and blood. He would hear the cries of the dying echo in his soul. And he would face the impossible, not once, but 75 times. This was not a story of war. It was a story of faith against fear, of courage without violence, and of a man who proved that you don't need a weapon to be a hero. The ridge awaited. The storm was coming. And Desmond Doss, the man who refused to kill, was walking straight into the heart of it. The morning of April 29, 1945, was painted in smoke and silence. The Pacific sky hung heavy, the sea below restless with dark waves. From the beachhead, the men of the 77th Infantry Division stared up at the monstrous cliff, Maeda Escarpment, a sheer wall of limestone the soldiers had named Hacksaw Ridge. The ridge loomed like a jagged scar against the horizon. At the top, hidden in a maze of trenches and tunnels, were the Imperial Japanese forces, waiting. They had sworn to fight to the last man. And as the Americans would soon learn, they meant it. Desmond Doss stood among them, a medic with no weapon, clutching nothing but his small canvas bag and a Bible. The others carried rifles, grenades, bayonets, tools of war. He carried bandages and faith. "Doss," Sergeant Howell grunted, tightening his helmet strap. "You sure you don't want a gun?" Desmond smiled softly. "No, sir. I'll have my hands full without one." The men laughed, not mockingly this time, but nervously, because in the eyes of those who had seen combat, even laughter was a way to hide fear. The signal came. Whistles screamed. The first wave began the climb. The soldiers scaled the cargo nets, their boots scraping the rock, their hands bleeding on the rope. The climb was slow, torturous, every inch gained under the shadow of death. Halfway up, the first artillery shell struck. The blast ripped through the ridge, showering them with dust and splinters of stone. "Go! Move!" Howell roared. "Get to the top!" When Doss reached the summit, he saw it. Hell on earth. The battlefield stretched before him like a nightmare. Smoke choked the air. Machine guns crackled from hidden bunkers. Bodies lay twisted in the mud, motionless. And through it all, the faint cry of the wounded, voices begging for help. The men hit the ground, scrambling for cover. "Medic! Medic!" someone shouted. Doss ran toward the sound. Bullets zipped past his head. Mortar blasts tore craters in the dirt. But Desmond didn't stop. He knelt beside a soldier whose leg was mangled by shrapnel, his face pale with shock. "You're gonna be all right," Doss said gently, pulling out his bandages. He worked fast, hands steady, murmuring a quiet prayer. When he finished, he looked up. The man was still conscious. Doss dragged him back to safety, crawling through mud and blood. Each inch was agony, but Desmond didn't look back. He never looked back. Hours turned into eternity. By afternoon, the ridge was littered with the dead. The Americans pushed forward, then fell back, then pushed again, each time paying in blood for a few more yards of ground. Doss moved among them like a ghost. When others fired, he bandaged. When others cursed, he prayed. When others ran for cover, he ran toward the fallen. The men began to notice. The coward, who refused to touch a rifle, was now the only one standing when everyone else fell. At one point, Doss found himself trapped in a foxhole with two soldiers. The ground shook as mortars rained around them. One of the men screamed in panic, clutching his bleeding arm. The other, his best friend, Smitty, stared at Doss with disbelief. "You're insane, you know that?" Smitty said, panting. "You could have stayed behind." Doss wiped sweat from his brow. "Can't leave them, Smitty. Not while they still need me." Smitty gave a short, shaky laugh. "You're something else, Doss." The two exchanged a look. A brief, silent moment of respect forged in chaos. Because for the first time, Smitty understood Doss wasn't just brave. He was unbreakable. Night fell like a curtain of darkness. The battlefield fell eerily silent, save for the groans of the wounded. Smoke drifted low over the ridge, carrying with it the scent of metal, mud, and death. The men huddled in shallow trenches, waiting for dawn. Doss sat alone, his Bible open on his lap, a small flashlight flickering in his hand. He read softly to himself, the words of comfort, of courage, of purpose. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words steadied him, reminded him why he was there. When a cry echoed nearby, Doss closed the Bible, slipped it into his pocket, and crawled toward the sound. He found a wounded soldier lying in the dark, blood pooling beneath him. "Hold on, I got you," Doss whispered. The man tried to speak, but no words came, only gasps. Doss pressed a bandage to his wound, his hands soaked in red. "Lord, give me strength," he prayed under his breath, and somehow he found it. One by one, he carried them back to the ridge's edge. He tied ropes around their bodies, lowering them down to the medics waiting below. Each descent was a fight against exhaustion, pain, and fear, but every time he let go of the rope, every time another man reached safety, Doss whispered the same words, "Please, Lord, help me get one more." At dawn, the Japanese counterattack came like a storm. They emerged from the tunnels screaming, their bayonets gleaming in the sun. The air exploded in fire. The Americans, unprepared, were driven back toward the cliff. "Retreat!" Howell shouted. "Get off the ridge!" Men ran in every direction, stumbling over the wounded. But Doss didn't move. He ran the other way, back toward the gunfire. He dragged the wounded into cover, tore his shirt into strips for bandages, and shielded others with his own body. At one point, a grenade landed near him. Without thinking, he kicked it away, the blast tearing into his leg. He winced but kept going, crawling through the smoke. Pain didn't stop him. Fear didn't stop him. Nothing could. When the sun finally set again, the ridge was silent. The Americans below believed everyone left up there was dead. But Doss was still alive and still working. For hours through the night, he searched. Every shadow, every whisper in the dark, he followed it. Some men were beyond saving. Others clung to life by a thread. He gave them water, whispered prayers, and carried them one by one to the edge. When his arms could no longer lift, he dragged. When his legs failed, he crawled. But he never stopped. Down below, the soldiers watching from camp couldn't believe what they were seeing. Bodies kept descending the cliff. Not lifeless bodies, but living men, lowered carefully on ropes. One after another, dozens of them. "Who's sending them down?" someone asked. "Must be a whole team up there." But there was no team. There was just Desmond Doss, alone. He worked through the night, whispering his prayer again and again. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." By the time dawn broke over the Pacific, the ridge was painted gold with sunlight and red with sacrifice. Doss collapsed to his knees, his uniform torn, his hands blistered, his face blackened by smoke. He had saved dozens, but he wasn't finished yet. Somewhere in the ruins, he heard another voice. Weak, barely audible. "Help me." Desmond looked toward the sound, eyes half closed from exhaustion. And with the last of his strength, he stood up and walked back into the smoke. He would not stop. Not until there were no more voices left. And though no one yet knew it, that night, that impossible night, Desmond Doss would save 75 men with nothing but his hands, his rope, and his faith. He didn't count them. He didn't even think about it. He only knew one thing: there was still one more out there. And as long as someone was calling for help, he would answer. The ridge had turned into a graveyard. Days bled into nights, nights into endless silence broken only by gunfire and screams. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air, mixing with the acrid stench of death. And still, Desmond Doss remained on the front lines. Unarmed, unyielding, unafraid. His body ached, his hands trembled from exhaustion. But every time his strength faltered, he whispered the same prayer that had carried him through the storm. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." By now, the men of his unit had stopped laughing at him. They stopped calling him a coward. Because when the night fell over Hacksaw Ridge, and bullets turned the darkness alive with death, the one man they prayed to see crawling toward them was Doss. It was May 2nd, 1945. The 77th Division had taken the ridge again, advancing through trenches that looked like open wounds carved into the earth. But the Japanese defenders, hidden in caves, tunnels, and spider holes, refused to yield. It was a battlefield that ate men alive. Sergeant Howell barked orders, his face streaked with mud. "Move! Keep pushing forward!" The men charged, firing into the smoky haze. Machine guns erupted. Grenades exploded in bursts of fire and dirt. Doss ran behind them, not to fight but to save. He slid into a crater where two men lay motionless. One was gone. The other clutched his chest, gasping for air. Doss ripped open his bag, pressing gauze into the wound. "Stay with me," he murmured. "You're going home." A mortar shell landed nearby, flinging him backward. Dirt rained down, rocks pelting his helmet. He shook it off, ears ringing, and went back to work. Hours later, as the Americans pushed deeper into enemy lines, the Japanese launched a counterattack. Fierce, desperate, suicidal. From underground tunnels, they poured out like shadows, shouting as they charged. The ridge became chaos. Rifle fire shredded the air. Men fell screaming. Smoke swallowed the world. Doss sprinted through it, dragging the wounded to safety. "Get down!" Howell yelled as a grenade clattered near them. The explosion lifted Doss off his feet, searing his leg with shrapnel. He hit the ground, his vision blurring. For a second, all he heard was a high-pitched ringing. Then a voice. "Medic! Medic!" He blinked, forcing his eyes open. The battlefield came back into focus, and with it, another soldier bleeding out just a few yards away. Doss tried to stand. Pain shot up his side, white-hot. He gritted his teeth and crawled. Every movement was agony, every breath a battle. But pain had no power over him. Not anymore. He reached the man and tore open his shirt. A deep wound, bleeding fast. Doss worked quickly, wrapping a bandage, whispering encouragement. "You're gonna be all right. Stay with me." He dragged the man to a trench, each inch feeling like a mile. Bullets tore the ground around him, but he kept going until the soldier was safe. When Doss finally collapsed, he realized his uniform was soaked. Not just with blood, but with his own. He pressed a hand to his leg. Warmth spread beneath his palm. The shrapnel was still there, buried deep. But there was no time to rest. Others still needed him. As night fell again, the ridge was littered with the wounded. Doss crawled from one to another, his body shaking, whispering prayers under his breath. He carried a wounded man on his shoulders through the mud, his bare feet slipping in blood-soaked earth. When he reached the edge, he tied another rope and lowered the man down. Each movement sent waves of pain through his body, but he refused to stop. Below, the men who once mocked him watched in silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. The man who refused to kill was saving more lives than anyone who carried a gun. As the days went on, Doss became something of a legend on the ridge. Whenever someone shouted "medic," even the fiercest soldiers prayed that Desmond would answer. And somehow he always did. Word spread through the ranks. Even officers who had once doubted him now whispered his name with reverence. "He's protected by something," Howell muttered once, staring at Doss moving through a field of bullets untouched. "Something not of this world." But Doss would have disagreed. He wasn't protected by anything supernatural. He believed only by faith and the conviction that every life mattered, even the lives of his enemies. During a brief lull in the fighting, Doss came across a Japanese soldier lying in the dirt. The man was young, barely more than a boy, clutching his side, breathing shallowly. For a moment, Doss froze. He knew the others would have finished the job, but he couldn't. He knelt beside the enemy, pressing a bandage to his wound. The boy looked at him, eyes wide, terrified. "It's all right," Doss whispered softly. "You'll be all right." When he stood up again, the ridge was silent, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just saving lives anymore. He was saving what was left of humanity in the middle of hell. The next morning, May 5th, the sky turned gray with rain. The battle raged again, worse than before. Flamethrowers lit up the tunnels. Artillery thundered from the sea. The Japanese counterattack hit like a tidal wave. The Americans, outnumbered and exhausted, were pushed back toward the edge of the ridge. Doss was hit again, this time by a sniper's bullet that tore through his arm. He fell, clutching it tight, blood streaming down his sleeve. A medic ran toward him, but Doss waved him off. "Go help someone else," he said through gritted teeth. He tore a bandage with his teeth and tied it himself. Then, incredibly, he picked up another wounded man and started dragging him back to safety with one arm. Hours later, as the Americans prepared to retreat, Doss was still on the ridge. He refused to leave. He crawled through the mud, finding the last few survivors, men hidden in craters, calling weakly for help. He dragged them to the edge, lowering them down one by one with his good arm. At one point, as the enemy advanced, he spotted two soldiers lying ahead. One American, one Japanese. Both bleeding, both near death. Doss paused. The Japanese soldier reached out weakly, his fingers trembling. Doss stared at him for a long moment, then pressed his last bandage into the man's hand before carrying the American back. Because even at the end of his strength, his compassion never wavered. When he finally collapsed, he was surrounded by the wounded he had saved. Howell found him barely conscious, his uniform shredded, his skin pale. "My God," the sergeant whispered, kneeling beside him. "How many did you get?" Doss blinked slowly, his lips cracked and dry. "Don't know," he murmured. "Didn't count." He looked up toward the smoke-filled sky and whispered again, his voice barely audible. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." They carried him down the ridge on a stretcher. As the medics worked to stop his bleeding, shells exploded in the distance. Then one final explosion ripped through the air. A sniper's bullet struck the stretcher bar above his head, shattering it, but the impact saved Doss from being hit directly. Even in that moment, the soldiers said it felt like divine intervention. As they reached the base, the men cheered. Dozens of faces, the very ones he had saved, looked up at him, tears mixing with dirt. No medals, no speeches, no glory, just silent gratitude. Doss closed his eyes, whispering one final prayer of thanks. He had given everything he had, and somehow it was enough. But his story wasn't over yet, because in the days that followed, what Doss had done began to spread across the Pacific. The man who refused to fight had become one of the most decorated heroes of the war. Yet he never saw himself as one. To Desmond Doss, he was just a man doing what he was called to do: to save, not to destroy, to heal, not to harm, to bring light into the darkest place on earth. And on the blood-soaked cliffs of Okinawa, that light would never fade. The night before the next assault, Desmond Doss sat in the makeshift tent under the Okinawan sky, its dark canvas trembling under the distant roar of artillery. Around him, soldiers cleaned their rifles, whispered to one another, and pretended not to be afraid. But the air was thick with the metallic tang of fear. Doss didn't have a rifle to clean. Instead, he carefully folded his blood-stained bandages, washed what little he could, and prayed softly. Not for himself, but for the men he would follow into hell the next day. "Lord," he whispered, his voice nearly lost to the wind, "give me strength to save one more, just one more." When morning broke, the ridge loomed again, a monstrous silhouette against the red dawn. Smoke coiled upward, and the cries of wounded men from the day before still echoed faintly from the plateau. Doss knew they were up there. American soldiers left behind, bleeding, dying. The order came, "Advance." The men climbed again, their boots slipping on blood-soaked ropes. Japanese machine guns opened fire immediately. The first wave was shredded before they even reached the top. Explosions tore through the rock. Shrapnel whistled through the air like hornets. By mid-morning, the assault had faltered. Men were screaming for medics, but none could reach them. The order was given to retreat once more. Everyone slid down the cliff. Everyone except Desmond Doss. He stayed. When the firing subsided, and the battlefield grew eerily silent, Doss began to move. Alone, he crawled through mud and corpses, searching for any sign of life. A faint groan caught his ear. He turned and found a man, Private Howell, clutching his abdomen, his uniform dark with blood. "Hold on," Doss whispered. He tore a strip from his own shirt, pressed it into the wound, and whispered a quick prayer before dragging the man to the edge of the ridge. Below, the ropes hung loosely, swaying in the smoke. There was no one to help him lower Howell down. So, inch by inch, Doss wrapped the rope around a fallen tree trunk, made a crude harness, and began lowering him alone. The rope burned his palms. His muscles trembled. He gritted his teeth and prayed as the wounded man disappeared below the smoke. When Howell's boots finally hit the ground safely, Doss collapsed back on the ridge, chest heaving. Then he looked up toward the battlefield again. Bodies were everywhere. Moans drifted through the night air, and Desmond said to himself, "Lord, please, help me get one more." That night, Desmond Doss became a ghost among the dead. He crawled through craters filled with mud and blood, bullets whizzing inches from his head. He dragged men by their collars, carried them on his back, sometimes two at a time. Each time he reached the edge, he would tie the rope, lower the wounded man, and whisper that same prayer, "Just one more, Lord, just one more." Down below, the soldiers waiting on the ground couldn't believe what they were seeing. One by one, wounded men were being lowered from the ridge, as if by some miracle. Private Smitty, the same man who once mocked Doss for being a coward, was one of them. When Doss found him, Smitty was barely conscious. "Desmond," he gasped, "you're still up here?" Doss nodded. "We're both getting out of here." He carried Smitty over his shoulder, every muscle screaming, until they reached the edge. Then, with trembling hands, he lowered his friend to safety. And when Smitty's boots touched the ground below, Doss didn't follow. He turned back and went for another. Hour after hour, through gunfire and explosions, through smoke and blood, he saved man after man. 75 times, he whispered that prayer. 75 times, he risked his life for another's. By dawn, Doss was barely conscious. His uniform was shredded, his hands torn raw, his body streaked with blood, but he refused to leave. When a flare lit the sky, it revealed him crawling through the carnage, dragging another soldier by his webbing. "Who's that idiot still up there?" One soldier shouted from below. Another replied, eyes wide with disbelief, "That's Doss." As the sun rose, the Japanese counterattacked again. Mortars pounded the ridge, and Doss was finally ordered to retreat. He hesitated. There were still wounded men up there, but his body was giving out. His hands shook uncontrollably. His vision blurred from exhaustion and dehydration. He stumbled toward the edge, still dragging one last man, when a grenade exploded beside him. The blast threw him backward. Shrapnel tore into his leg and arm. For a moment, he lay still. The world around him spun. He tried to stand and fell. Then he saw the rope, dangling at the cliff's edge. He gritted his teeth and began to crawl. Every inch was agony. His blood left a trail across the dirt. But he made it to the edge, secured the rope one final time, and lowered the last soldier down. Only then did he let himself collapse. His body hung half over the ridge, motionless. Below, the soldiers looked up, and for a terrible moment they thought he was dead. Then the rope twitched. Slowly, painfully, Doss began to climb down. When he reached the ground, his fellow soldiers ran to him, caught him before he fell. His face was pale, his hands blistered and bleeding, but his eyes were calm, serene. "How many, Desmond?" Captain Glover asked, kneeling beside him. Doss hesitated, his voice hoarse. "I don't rightly know, sir." Then he smiled faintly. "Guess it was about 75. Word of Doss's bravery spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers who had once mocked him now looked at him with awe. Even hardened sergeants couldn't find words to describe what they'd seen. Captain Glover himself went to the general to insist. "We're not going up that ridge again without Doss. If he's not with us, we're not going." And so, when the next assault came, the men waited at the base of Hacksaw Ridge. Doss, his arm in a sling, limped forward, carrying his Bible. He bowed his head in prayer, not for victory, but for mercy. The men around him fell silent. When he finished, they rose together, charged the ridge, and this time they took it. Hacksaw Ridge fell not just by bullets and bombs, but by the unyielding spirit of a man who refused to take a life, yet saved dozens. Later, as medics carried him back to the aid station, Doss passed out from blood loss. Even then, when he regained consciousness in the hospital tent, he refused a stretcher until the others were treated first. When a sniper's bullet shattered his arm days later, he tied it to a rifle stock to make a splint, the same rifle he'd refused to carry into battle. That rifle, once a symbol of violence, became, in his hands, a tool for survival. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Doss smiled faintly when someone pointed it out. "Guess God's got a sense of humor," he said. As he was finally evacuated from the front lines, the men of his company stood in silence, removing their helmets as he passed. Not one of them would ever forget what they saw on that ridge. In that moment, Desmond Doss, the man they'd once mocked as weak, strange, and unfit for combat, became a legend. He didn't fire a single shot, but he changed the war. And as the stretcher bearers carried him away, Doss looked back one last time at Hacksaw Ridge, the place where faith, courage, and mercy had met in the fire of war. He whispered a final prayer under his breath, soft as the wind. "Thank you, Lord, for letting me save one more." The war was ending, but for Desmond Doss, the battle had already been won. Not on a grand scale of territory or politics, but within the hearts of the men he had fought beside. He returned from Okinawa broken in body but unbroken in spirit. His uniform was tattered, his hands permanently scarred, and his body riddled with fragments of metal that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But when he stepped off that transport ship onto American soil, there was no cheering crowd, no fanfare, no parade. He didn't need one. The real victory was knowing that 75 men had gone home to their families because of him, because he refused to give up, refused to hate, refused to stop believing that one man's compassion could defy the madness of war. In the months following Okinawa, Desmond was hospitalized repeatedly. The wounds from shrapnel, the tuberculosis he contracted from battlefield conditions, and the lingering trauma of what he'd seen made his recovery long and painful. But even there, in the hospital, he became something of a legend. Nurses would whisper his name as they passed, and soldiers who had heard the story of the medic who saved 75 men without a weapon would come just to shake his hand. Still, Desmond was humble to the core. When reporters came to ask him about the battle, he simply said, "I just wanted to save as many as I could. I don't feel I did anything special." Yet what he had done was beyond special. In October 1945, in a quiet ceremony on the White House lawn, President Harry S. Truman personally presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration. Truman, a man who had seen countless soldiers come and go, looked Doss in the eyes and said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The crowd fell silent as Truman pinned the medal to Desmond's chest. Doss stood there, small, modest, almost uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't fought for medals. He hadn't fought for recognition. He had fought for his faith, and for the lives of men who, days earlier, had laughed at him. The Medal of Honor citation read, "Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, Private First Class Doss saved the lives of 75 men. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty." But those words couldn't capture the full weight of what he had done, or the quiet grace with which he lived afterward. Desmond Doss went home to Virginia and married his childhood sweetheart, Dorothy Schutte. They lived simply, raising their son in a small house surrounded by woods. He built his own furniture, grew his own food, and attended church every Sabbath. Fame meant nothing to him. The Medal of Honor stayed tucked in a small box most of the time, only brought out when school children came by to ask about it. When people asked how he managed to do what he did, Doss would always smile and answer, "I just kept praying, Lord, please help me get one more." But the price of his heroism followed him for the rest of his life. His lungs, damaged by tuberculosis, would eventually collapse entirely, forcing him to live with one lung. His hearing was lost almost completely due to medical complications. And yet, even when the world around him went quiet, Desmond's faith did not falter. He continued to pray, continued to inspire, continued to live with the same unshakable gentleness that had carried him through the war. When the filmmakers who would one day tell his story, in what became Hacksaw Ridge, came to interview him, he hesitated. He didn't want fame. He didn't want money. He just wanted to make sure that people knew the truth, that you can stand by your beliefs, even when the world tells you you're wrong, and still serve with honor. The power of Desmond Doss's story lies not in violence, but in conviction. In a world that demanded blood, he offered healing. In a time of chaos, he offered compassion. He proved that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, through trembling hands, whispered prayers, and the quiet determination to do what's right, no matter the cost. Even decades after his death in 2006, soldiers and medics still speak his name with reverence. In the halls of military academies, his story is taught as a lesson in both faith and valor, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. And on the walls of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, his face watches silently from a portrait. Not in battle gear, but in his medic uniform, Bible in hand, the faintest smile on his lips. Desmond Doss's life forces us to ask a question that echoes across generations. What does it truly mean to be brave? Is it charging into battle with a rifle in hand? Or is it standing firm in your faith when the world mocks you for it? Is it killing your enemy or saving him when you could have walked away? Desmond Doss showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the triumph of conviction over it. He showed us that faith isn't weakness, it's strength beyond reason. And he showed us that even in humanity's darkest moments, one person's light can shine so brightly that it burns through the fog of war. In his final years, Desmond often sat on his porch at sunset, gazing out across the fields in quiet reflection. Visitors who came to see him always found the same man who had crawled through hell on Okinawa, gentle, humble, and still deeply grateful. When asked if he ever regretted refusing to carry a weapon, he simply said, "No, my weapon was my faith." He would then smile softly and add, "And it never jammed." Today, his legacy lives on, not only in history books or Hollywood films, but in every act of compassion performed in the face of violence, in every medic who runs toward danger to save a life, in every person who chooses mercy over vengeance. Desmond Doss stands as proof that you don't need to take a life to be a hero. All you need is the courage to love in a world that's forgotten how. Desmond Doss's story isn't just about one man's faith. It's about what we can all become when we stand for what's right, even when it's unpopular, even when it's impossible. If the story moved you, share it. Let it remind the world that heroism doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes, it wears compassion. Because in the end, history doesn't remember those who destroy, it remembers those who heal. And somewhere, In the quiet echoes of Hacksaw Ridge, one can still almost hear his voice, soft, resolute, unbroken. "Lord, please help me get one more."